So chapter 10, as you see, is entitled Mrs. Sparsit's Staircase. يعني أكو بعض الكتب some أو many of your books, many of your books we have the wrong title. You find it Suitcase. في الكتب مالتكم the title is Mrs. Sparsit's Suitcase, and this is incorrect. I checked the original version of the book and it seems to be a staircase, سلم, درج. It is not suitcase. Suitcase يعني حقيبة, and the staircase is درج. So suitcase is does not fit in here. Please change it in your books and make it a staircase instead of suitcase.
دكتور أنا موجود بكتاب staircase.
Yeah, some of
درج السيدة سبارس.
ما أعرف. أنا الكتاب اللي عندي هذا الكتاب اللي أسود الكفر مالته موجودة staircase, suitcase. And I believe many of your books say the same. أيضا suitcase. Anyway, if it's suitcase, change it to staircase. That's all. So, in continuation to what we witnessed in the previous chapter, hearing the last of it showed a kind of, let's say, a kind of a close connection between James and Louisa, and this is going to be developed from now on, because as I told you, Mrs. Sparsit played an important role in keeping Louisa, encouraging her indirectly to step back from her husband. وشفتوا إنه a kind of argument took place between Louisa and her husband. So such kind of event, of course, would encourage Louisa to move closer towards another person, اللي هو James, and James is already developing this issue. Of course, this serves the general structure or the general frame of the novel, because the writer wants to prove this kind of incident. He wants to say that this is the educational system which is adopted in this state, in this government. Look, we don't have successful people or successful products. What we have is a robber, مثل ما شفنا في Tom, and a failure in terms of marriage and wife, اللي هي Louisa. The title shows something, reveals something. Mrs. Sparsit's Staircase. What we understand here is that there is a staircase, and we are talking about the relationship between James and Louisa. And this kind of relationship, of course, Louisa and James and Sparsit now are at the top, yani in the second floor. Whenever James and Louisa are getting closer by any kind of circumstances, they are stepping one step down. راح تشوفون عندنا هنا تشابترات راح تجينا later. واحد منها lower and lower, أسفل فأسفل, واحد منها down, واحد all refer to that we are going to the bottom, إلى الحضيض, إلى الأسفل. So the staircase refers to the relationship between James and Louisa, and how far they are proceeding and developing their relationship, and the stepping steps to reach the final degree or the final step of that staircase.
It's imaginary staircase.
What, please?
It's imaginary staircase.
It is
imaginary.
Illusionary.
Yes.
Maybe. يعني, but it is at the same time it is real. يعني it is somehow a kind of line that Sparsit draws, and as if she visualizes, وكأنه Mrs. Sparsit visualizes what is coming next, لأنه the plans that she has in mind are going to be achieved. There is a kind of technique in fiction, in narration. It is called the omniscient narrator يسميه الكاتب موجود في The Great Gatsby تاخذوها السنة بتجي إن شاء الله. The writer calls it the omniscient narrator الراوي العليم اللي يعرف شنو راح يصير بأحداث الرواية. I feel that Sparsit, just like playing this role, she predicts what's coming next and she gives us hints and information about the kind of relationship between James and Louisa, and she will give us more hints about this relationship later. وأشياء will be achieved at the end of the novel. So the writer starts the chapter with Mrs. Sparsit's nerves being slow to recover their tone. The worthy woman made a stay of some weeks in duration at Bounderby's retreat. The previous chapter also started with the Sparsit's nerves. الأعصاب مالتها تعبانة ولذلك تحتاج إلى عناية. At this chapter also her nerves are تعبانة and she has not recovered very well, so she keeps a stay in Bounderby's house. At the same time, she is keeping an eye on Louisa indirectly, so she is our spy, the reader's spy on Louisa and James. We know many details about James and Louisa through the character of Sparsit, through her speech. So Mr. Bounderby, having got it into his explosive compositions that Sparsit was a highly superior woman, of course this kind of speech keeps being repeated by Bounderby. And further, that Louisa would have objected to her as a frequent visitor. Louisa does not like to see her very often. If it had comported with his greatness that she should object to anything. But of course she is not obeyed by Bounderby. Here you find Bounderby. I tell you what, ma'am, you shall come down here of a Saturday while the fine weather lasts and stay till Monday, to which Mrs. Sparsit returned, in effect, though not of Mohammedan persuasion, to hear is to obey. Some of you might ask about this. This is related to one of the responses made by Shahrazad in the 1000 Nights and One, when she answered the Prince Shahryar, to hear is to obey. يعني شنو؟ يعني سمعا وطاعة, in reference to Bounderby's directions. لأنه قال لها تجين كل سبت وتبقين إلى الاثنين, to stay here, to have rest, to eat, to rest, and she says to hear is to obey. سمعا وطاعة. So this paragraph shows what I've been discussing just now. It became the business of Mrs. Sparsit's life to look up at her staircase. صار شغلها الشاغل إنه to watch the staircase and to watch Louisa coming down. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, sometimes several steps at one bout. أحيانا تطفر درجتين ثلاثة Louisa, in reference to the development of the relationship between her and James. Sometimes stopping, never turning back. If she had once turned back, it might have been the death of Mrs. Sparsit in spleen and grief. هنا reference تأكيد على ما صار في الباراجراف الأخير في the previous chapter, that Mrs. Sparsit, that Mrs. Gradgrind, sorry, no, not Mrs. Gradgrind. This shows that this would disappoint Mrs. Sparsit إذا ما لويزا قدمت شيء باتجاه العلاقة بينها وبين بين James. This would make her a grief, يعني راح تكون حزينة جدا إذا ما تطورت العلاقة بين لويزا و James. She had been descending steadily بثبات to the day, and on the day when Mr. Bounderby issued the weekly invitation recorded above, Sparsit was in good spirits and inclined to be conversational. So now she is watching every move, every step that and that Louisa makes. Um, Here some references to Tom, I think, yeah. Continued boundary. I have not heard anything more about it, talking about the robbery that took place 2 chapters earlier. It is in hand, though, and young Tom, who rather sticks to business at present, something new for him. He hadn't the schooling I had, is helping. Someone of you asked whether Bounderby had any suspicions towards Tom in the previous lecture, and I told you it is not made clear in the text. This underscores and confirms that Bounderby never had any suspicion towards Tom, because he says he is helping. The old woman I mentioned, ma'am, said Bounderby, cutting the matter short as it was nothing to boast about. The old woman has disappeared along with Stephen. At this particular chapter, we understand that they are no more available. So Bounderby has some suspicions about this old woman. So he says the old woman is not laid hold of, ما مسكوها لحد الآن, but she may take her oath she will be, ولكن راح تخضع للقانون وتقسم على that she did or did not take or rob the bank, if that is any satisfaction to her villainous old mind. So he has some suspicions with the old woman. In the meantime, ma'am, I am of opinion, if you ask my opinion, that the less she is talked about, the better. That same evening, Sparsit, in her chamber window, resting from her packing operations, looked towards her great staircase, and saw Louisa is still descending. راح نشوف تأكيد على هذا الكلام. يعني every now and then it will be highlighted to keep us, to keep the reader's mind busy with this kind of relationship. She sat by Mr. Harthouse in an alcove, يعني مكان مغطى بالحديقة, talking very low. He stood leaning over her. طبعا هذا description according to Mrs. Sparsit. Stood leaning, هيجي مدنقة عليه. They whispered together, and his face almost touched her hair. If not quite, said Sparsit, straining her hawk's eyes, وكأنه تنظر عليهم بعيون ما الصقر, to the utmost. Sparsit was too distant to hear a word of their discourse, ما كانت تسمع شيء من الحديث, or even to know that they were speaking softly otherwise than from the expression of their figures. But what they said was this. يعني she hardly heard them speaking, ولكن اللي سمعته انه Louisa and James were talking. You recollect the man, Mr. Harthouse? تتذكر الشخص? Oh, perfectly. His face, his manner, and what he said. Perfectly. And an infinitely dreary person he appeared to me to be, lengthy and prosy in the extreme. It was knowing to hold forth. My good fellow, you are overdoing this. It has been very difficult to me to think ill of that man. يعني كان المفروض ما أفكر بطريقة سيئة, ولكن it seems that he is a suspect. And منو هذا اللي دا يحجون عنه? He seems to be this one, Stephen. So the old woman is suspected by Mr. Bounderby, and Stephen is suspected by Mr. James and Louisa. So we have 2 suspects now who already disappeared in these 2 chapters. Yani they no more exist. They are not available. My dear Louisa, as Tom says, which he never did say, you know no good of the fellow. No, certainly you don't know about anything about Stephen, so you would not suspect him. I almost feel as though it must be bad in me, returned Louisa, after sitting thoughtful a while, to be so ready to agree with you, and to be so lightened in my heart by what you say. and she finds it difficult to agree with him concerning what he said about Stephen. I only say what is reasonable, nothing worse. I have talked it over with my friend Tom more than once. Of course, James tries to get it closer, so he highlights these phrases. My friend Tom, my close friend Tom, we agree together, we walk together, we eat together. So he keeps shooting these sentences in order to reach Louisa and be very close to her. I have talked it over with my friend Tom more than once. Of course, I remain on terms of perfect confidence with Tom. على ثقة عالية جدا مع Tom. And he is quite of my opinion. وكذلك هو يتوافق معي دائما. And I am quite of his. Will you walk? نتمشى? And they moved away, beginning to be indistinct. بعد ما يبينون in the twilight. She leaning on his arm. تميل على الذراع مالته. And she little thought how she was going down Mrs. Sparsit's staircase. This is being overemphasized in this chapter. The relationship and the going down and the development of the relationship. There are so many references that confirm this issue. Night and day, Mrs. Sparsit kept it standing when Louisa had arrived at the bottom and disappeared in the gulf. يعني وصلت لي أسفل شيء وبعدين اختفت في هذا الgulf. It might fall in upon her if it would. With all her defense for Mr. Bounderby, as contradistinguished from his portrait, Mrs. Sparsit had not the smallest intention of interrupting the descent. الكاتب يقول لنا هنا تعرفون Mrs. Sparsit وشون تتلوق Mr. Bounderby and how she keeps herself pays attention and concerned about him and his welfare and his interest. But here she never did the smallest intention, she never had the smallest intention حتى لو نية جدا بسيطة of interrupting the descent. Of course the descent of Louisa down with James would hurt Mr. Bounderby, but Sparsit did not do that, did not help it here. So she waited for the last fall إلى السقوط الأخير. As for the ripeness إلى النضوج and fullness of the harvest of her hopes. ونضوج والحصاد مال آمالها هي. Of course, the destruction of the relationship between Louisa and Bounderby. So the chapter showed how double-faced is Mrs. Sparsit to Bounderby. احنا نعرف هذا الشيء from previous chapters. قدامها تحكي شكل وبعدها تقوم تتأفأف and she keeps talking and biting his back. We saw Louisa's progress. Of course, such kind of relationships might develop some events that may lead to adultery. For example, if Stephen and the old woman are reported missing and suspected at the robbery, and as you see, James talks about Stephen and incriminates him with the robbery. يجرم ويتهم بقضية السرقة. So these are the main points that we might find at the chapter. Of course, and whenever we talk about these details, you keep the writer's intentions, the writer's moves, and the writer's principles. What does the writer want through this? What does the writer want to say through this event, through this character, through this idea? So when we ask and when you answer, keep the writer in mind and think just like the writer wants us to think. We don't need to talk about every detail, like James woke up, James took his breakfast, Bounderby had an argument with Louisa, because everything here is presented for a purpose. and we need to keep that purpose in mind اللي هو the writer's purpose. And so far we have not more to add to this chapter. If you have any questions, please go ahead.